Ready when you are.
Drops, shops, and ginger pop, all on this week's finger-pointing episode of I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast that's very partial to tea and muffins, with your hosts John West
and Matt Needer. On tonight's programme, the Fourth Doctor hits the pub and ends up in a face-off with Sarah. Meanwhile, the Kralls are hatching an invasion plan that's literally a licence to print money. We rip off our eye patches and bear witness to the android invasion. Hello, John.
Hey, how are you?
All right, thank you. How are you?
I thought I'd make an effort.
Looking very smart this evening. I like it.
You remarked on my attire as this is obviously useless information for those of the listeners.
The listeners,
both of them.
Hello to the listeners, but hello viewers. You're getting the full splendour.
Viewer.
I mean, this is considerably better than many of the actual Doctor costumes, I think.
Well, yes. I thought I'd make a bit of an effort because I feel like the thronging audience demands that we make an effort. You're looking very dapper as well yourself.
Thank you very much. Yeah? Yes, I think I've dressed as Mike Love from the Beach Boys tonight. But yeah, we'll see how that goes. Anyway, here we are talking about, and we're ready for another conversation about Doctor Who. And after a few weeks sort of orbiting around the modern series, we're going back to the classic series.
We are.
For the Android Invasion, Series 13, Tom Baker's second series. John, you're the man with the numbers.
Yeah, so the Android Invasion, it's the fourth story from the 13th season.
Yep.
So we're talking about the broadcast dates 22nd of November to the 13th of December 1975.
Yep.
Obviously, you've got Tom Baker, Liz Sladen as the key, the TARDIS crew. This was written by Terry Nation.
Yep.
Obviously, inventor of the Daleks, at least the concept of them, not how the amazing way they look, which is probably most of it, but there you are. Sorry.
Well, okay.
That's a whole separate
Put a pin in that.
Yeah. And the producer, Philip Hinchcliffe, script editor, Robert Holmes, something of an imperial, I think a lot of people would consider this a kind of imperial phase of Doctor Who. Interestingly, though, directed by Barry Letts, the previous producer of the show, and obviously one of the major drivers of the Pertwee era, an era that we obviously know and love. This involves Unit.
And the man who cast Tom Baker as well. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
Well, indeed, yes. And we've got, that's right, and we've got Unit as well.
Yep.
So, there is a degree of sort of continuity there. But yeah, so Barry Letts directs. I came at this weirdly, like I essentially basically had no preconceived notion of this story at all.
Right.
Or sort of really any sense.
Had you seen this before?
No, absolutely not. No. I mean, I barely knew it existed.
Can I tell you about my history with it? Just because I was convinced for many years that I had seen this. And it was only really while watching it that I realised that I hadn't. I was watching it for the first time.
Yeah.
And in unwrapping that in my brain as to why did I think I'd seen it, I sort of realised that actually my whole origin story with Doctor Who kind of shifted a bit. That obviously, as we've discussed many times before, my entry point into the series was watching the 1993 repeat of Planet of the Daleks when I was 10. But that wasn't my first brush with Doctor Who. Prior to that, maybe a couple of years earlier, I had read the target novel of the Android Invasion, which was the only Doctor Who book in our primary school library. And I obviously pulled it off the shelf thinking oh, this is a cool thing. It had a green alien with a saggy face on the front. I thought, oh, this looks exciting. So obviously read it. And I think that meant that when Planet of the Daleks rolled around, I was sort of familiar with the basic premise of Doctor Who.
Yeah.
But then I remember and I'd completely forgotten about this, but obviously we had a school Doctor Who club that we would go to, where basically on a, I can't even remember, maybe it was a Friday lunchtime or something, we'd watch an episode of a VHS as a group. And I remember when the guy who ran it brought the Android Invasion in on VHS, and because I was excited to see it, because I'd only read the book, I very loudly shouted, "Oh my God, it's the Android Invasion." And the teacher, whose classroom this all took place in, got really annoyed that I was being overly exuberant and sent me out, so I missed it.
Right. Okay.
So I thought I'd seen... For years, I was kind of like, I have seen it. And I was like...
That's quite an uncharacteristically severe reaction from this particular teacher, if I remember. I was at the same school, of course. So.
Yeah, it was all very odd. But yeah, basically all of this had got jumbled up in my head for years, saying that I thought I'd seen this, but actually I hadn't. I'd just read the book and missed an opportunity to see it. Anyway, I'm sure this is incredibly tedious to the listeners.
Let's get into the nuts and bolts of this.
Right.
Do you feel that your let's say 12-year-old self was cheated? Have you missed 29 years of having this in your memory banks? Was it good?
Was it?
Did you like it?
What are you saying here? In a nutshell, not really. I thought this was quite dull, and I think, it's interesting you said it sort of, you weren't even really aware of what its reputation was.
I feel that
as a story.
Yes,
and it's definitely. I think if you actually read around about it, it's considered like not a very good story, but
a bit of a dud.
A bit of a dud, but it's very much floated by the greatness around it. You've got the Imperial team, you've got Tom Baker, on peak form, and he's really bloody good in this.
Yes,
Tom Baker's great in it. But yeah, it's a bit of a misfire, and I think coming at it, bluntly, I think it's very boring, it's very repetitive, it's very unoriginal, and also, it's just one of those things where, like, one of the main drivers of the story is, like, how dumb and stupid everyone is, which sort of really spins its wheels. And I was quite... I didn't think it was very good. We watched lots of Doctor Who on this, and probably about 50% of the time come away from the conclusion saying, well, yeah, that one wasn't very good.
Yeah.
I was quite disappointed with this because I think one of the sort of like tent poles of I'll explain later is our enthusiasm for Terry Nation, who is sort of, I think, not always, he's regarded as like the guy who invented the Daleks. He's not necessarily regarded as one of the series' great writers, but I think as we've gone deeper into the Dalek stories, we've realised that he is absolutely the master of allegory. He's phenomenal, I think, ideas man, particularly when working in an allegorical context. And I think that papers over a lot of the things that I think are quite limited about his abilities as a dramatist.
But here, obviously, this is not a Dalek. This is one of, I think, only 2 non-Dalek stories that he contributes. There's this and there's the Keys of Marinus, like in the first series of the Hartnell era. And yeah, I think, to be honest, like, you take his toys away from him, or certainly you take the Daleks away from him, and it sort of feels like he doesn't really have anything to say. By the way, we actually completely forgot to summarise the plot of this. We just got straight into talking about the history with it. Not that our listeners need us to do this, but it's basically they turn up, creepy village, everyone's behaving very oddly. They're clearly androids.
They're clearly androids, partly because it's called the Android Invasion in episode 1. So the slightly slower reveal that Nation goes for in terms of teasing you that they're androids is sort of slightly blown by like one of the literal words.
Well, no, I think that the rug pull is more about where they are, isn't it?
Yes.
And so that's
not a bad rope. The thing is, there are little bits of this that in isolation are pretty good. Like Tom Baker is bloody great in this, and I'd like to let's put an asterisk in that to talk about that a bit more. There are also bits. Some of the stuff around the village is like genuinely creepy. Like the first scene where the truck rolls in. Basically, the Doctor and Sarah are exploring this deserted pub.
Yeah.
and the truck rolls in,
and the Cluedo characters,
and they all file in, and then as soon as the
file
clock
up.
strikes, they suddenly like turn into like a sort of lively, chatty sort of the bonhomie of the English pub.
Yeah.
And some of that stuff is, I mean, it's well directed. I mean, Barry Lett's no slouch in that department, I think. Although again, even he can't paper over how sort of leaden some of this is in parts. So there are good bits, like the setting's good. You know, and it's certainly at the beginning. Like episode 1 is, I think, okay, and it's quite creepy. There is some great imagery.
I think episode 1's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, I liked this slightly more than you did.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
While I would, albeit I agree with everything you said,
Right.
but I just liked it rather more. I think that the sort of the things that, I mean, look, I think this is okay, right?
Okay.
I don't think it's great.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make any claims that this is fantastic, but it held my attention. What I think, but in episode 1, I loved the little details that the Doctor picked up on, like the coins all being freshly minted, and
The coin bit is great. Yeah.
like it's just it's a lovely little bit of business, that.
Because it also weaves in a lot about how he perceives. I mean, it's like, because to be honest, like he spots the details that everyone else would miss, and you know, it's not Sarah that spots that; it's that he. So in a way, it not only sort of develops his character, but also develops the situation. Like the little tells are very.
But I thought the whole sort of I don't know, Village of the Damned sort of the whole creepy English village.
Yeah. Well, Wikipedia says that Nation was, quote, heavily inspired by Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Right, okay.
Which I think, you know,
checks out.
almost entirely Xeroxed it, including, you know, so many of the bits of setup, you know, the fact they're literally pod people who go into those, come out of those pods and get moved around. I mean, it's like, it's a direct lift. And I don't think is doing anything particularly interesting in terms of, you know, obviously, you know, Doctor Who lifts from all sorts of stuff, and it always should. And I mean, actually, I think it's that kind of genre pastiching that Philip Hinchcliffe is so good at. I mean, he sort of arrives.
I
at
actually
that
meant
quite early
Invasion
on.
of the Body Snatchers earlier.
Oh,
but
sorry.
So
No,
yes,
but Village of the Damned, fair point as
but
well.
also
in
like,
terms of sort of creepy.
but I think it's no, because I was thinking. But yeah, I think it's really well handled. The location is the location is fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that it is very. I think the creepiness is really well established in episode 1, and I really liked the rapport and the dialogue between the Doctor and Sarah Jane. That feels like a very real relationship.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I really like about, I mean, something we were discussing, not talking about Doctor Who, wastefully discussing Doctor Who while not recording. But one of the things you were talking about was like
Try to avoid that these days.
Stephen Moffat is, as a writer, very interested in why companions travel with the Doctor, right? What I love about Sarah Jane is she's a journalist.
Yeah.
That's the answer. That's the reason. Her inbuilt curiosity is a route one way to explain why she's there. And,
Absolutely.
And the companions having a compelling reason to be there and want to be in the adventure is a rather more important part of Doctor Who than you might at first think. But yeah, I think it's
also
helps.
her journalist background it means that actually one of the info dumps is much more elegantly done here, because basically, we obviously there's this thing that like within this village and the space center, all of which turn out to be replicas that have been built on the planet Ozidon by the evil Kralls. But there is operating here this astronaut, Guy Crayford, who's part of the British space program, and he disappeared into deep space 2 years ago and was considered
who apparently
dead and
never
lost.
takes a shower.
Well,
because or at least if he does, he keeps his eye patch on while he's doing so.
It's really stink.
Yeah, I mean that's an issue. I mean, like Milton Johns as
Milton Johns is always fun. I mean,
of course.
as like man on the verge of a nervous breakdown, which is basically the role he plays out.
But
every time he turns
well, the
up.
only explanation is that he's gone mad, because the plot doesn't really make any sense if he believes, like, it doesn't make any sense that he believes what he's saying about like the Krall want to peacefully invade, and why shouldn't they? It requires on him being a bit of an idiot, like you said.
Absolutely, which is, and I mean, obviously it's meant to be. And to be fair, I remember that's one of the scenes that really stood out from the Terrance Dicks novel that I remember from reading when I was 8. It's like, the scene where he rips off the eye patch, and like 8-year-old me thought, Christ, that's a rug pull. But to see it now, obviously, you just go like, well, why has he never looked under?
What an idiot!
What an idiot! That is an interesting, and again, it's like, I suppose basically my whole problem with this is that like it's not really about anything.
No.
It's just doing a run on Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yeah, but it's really not about anything. And like, I was trying to look for parallels because obviously Terry Nation has certain preoccupations.
Yeah.
There's a little bit
mainly World War II.
Yeah, well, I think with Stigron.
Yeah.
I think with Stigron, there is a sort of bit of a nod at the kind of Joseph Mengele sort of experiment, scientist in charge of.
Well, I think Stigron is sort of basically Davros, but like a sort of thinner version of that. You know, he's the guy who is
not physically thinner. He's quite a bit.
True.
He likes his suet pudding.
But he's conquest through science, basically. Yeah. He's the demented scientist, and like I did laugh a bit. I mean, they're not. I mean, this was another thing. I remember the look of the Kralls from the painting on the front cover of the Target novel. I think actually they're a sort of fun bit of design.
Oh, I like the Krall.
They're not. Yeah. It's not a particularly mobile mask, which means, and again, the fact that the two Kralls who have speaking roles. So there's Stigron and there's Marshal Chidaki, who they're very chatty, which means you can get. I always loved Gary Gillett's term for this, which is like squabbling rubber. Which is like basically when you have two. I
didn't bump on that. I liked and all the craggy skin hanging off and all that sort of stuff.
But I was going to say I did like the bit when Stigron's doing one of his experiments. And he says, "I shall now commence the analysis of the brain," which is like his proper sort of like Flash Gordon kind of movie
absolutely.
Stuff. But yeah, I sort of think. And because I was looking,
but it's not about anything.
No,
right? So you can sort of have a go at the sort of through line to it's a sort of Davros light character and the parallels with the science and medical sort of or pseudo medical experimentation under the Nazis. But there isn't it. That's really just a sort of a bit of character dressing for Stigron. It's not really about that. It's not really about anything. It's not like with...
No, he's just your bad scientist.
We recently reviewed the Daemons, and in that there are so many different things that it's sort of talking about from pop culture, the nature of science versus magic in fictionalized settings, and how the role that they both play in humans developing understanding of themselves and ourselves and why we're here. There's nothing, there's literally nothing to hang our hat on in terms of there's a parallel with this or, and I think it's fine as a bit of a romp, but it goes along at a decent pace. I think Barry Letz's direction is pretty good, actually. It goes along at a clip. The locations are well chosen, but there isn't any thematic meat for us to look back on this sort of 49 years later and say, isn't it amazing how all this sort of stuff? It's just, you're very much looking at it as it's an adventure. And even as an adventure, it's middling at best.
I think so. I think that's the thing, because it's like, as I say, I was excited to go into it because, we've got so much out of kind of revisiting the Terry Nation Dalek stories. I mean, huge amounts. But I think, and I remember saying this about Genesis of the Daleks, like Nation, when he's firing on all cylinders, is a guy who can throw in some really electric ideas. And I think, as an interesting voice kind of through the 70s, banging the drum of like, let's not misremember World War II, which is, absolutely what Planet of the Daleks is about. Is like, the way World War II, even at that point, was sort of coalescing into national myth rather than like thing terrible thing that happened.
Yeah, seen primarily through the war films of the 50s and 60s and into the 70s rather than the reality of it.
Yeah. And obviously, the genesis of the Daleks is this sort of, thing of how that kind of, lethal authoritarianism can kind of come about. And I was looking for something like that. But basically, he's a guy who can like have these kind of electric ideas, and they lift dramatically generally what he does, which is kind of quite stodgy procedural narratives.
Yeah.
It's like a lot of the actual movement of Genesis of the Daleks is just people plodding from location to location and cycling through it. But, the dramatic, the ideas engine of that story is so exciting and so riveting that it's like you keep your eyes on it.
Yeah.
Whereas this, there's
Less
not.
so.
And I was looking for the World War II read, and it's like, if you want to reach, you can probably find something. I mean, the fact that, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is sort of one of those, or certainly the 50s film is one of those kind of canonical sort of paranoid Cold War texts. I was also thinking, have you ever seen Went the Day Well?
No.
Which was a war movie. It was basically a propaganda film made during the war. And it's about a little English village that is taken over by the Germans by stealth. So there are these like British soldiers that return to the village, and no one knows that they're actually Germans until they basically the Germans stage a takeover in this small village.
Yeah.
And it's my favourite war film. I mean, it's absolutely riveting because basically it plays it for horror chills, even though it's basically also a propaganda film at the time. It's a stunning film. And there are elements of that here, but yeah, it just doesn't. I mean, thematically, it just doesn't coalesce, and so you are sort of. It's sort of Nation at its worst, really. It's the sort of stodgy procedural narrative and slightly sort of stock B-movie cliches, just without that kind of intellectual and allegorical heft that really motors his best work.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, I got by here on the production design. I mean, I love the Space Defense Center's control room. They do a good control room in the mid-70s.
They do a good control room. Are you talking about also then when we see the British space program, which is so open university? I love it. And
I also really love how they've designed a rocket and then just gone fuck it and used Saturn V.
100%,
sort of stock footage.
Not the only time, I think. I think that don't they use exactly that footage in Genesis of the Daleks? When the Thal rocket takes off.
Quite possibly. But anyway, but the production design, the performance of the main cast, I sort of liked this more than I'm able to analyze. I sort of just quite enjoyed the kind of general adventure feel. It goes along at a clip. You've got Tom Baker and Liz Sladen doing amazing work. The design is great. There's great location work. And I sort of got by on that. Yeah. And probably I was watching it at a moment of, a lot was going on at work, and I just needed to sort of have some like moving wallpaper and adventure playing out. And it's fine for it to be that. I think that when you do come to analyze it, the more you look, the less you see.
Yeah.
And like we talked already about Milton John's character, but also just the use of the doubles is just very clumsy in episode 4. Like you would want more sort of Harry stares at Harry stares back at Harry. There's interaction between them. There's a bit of business.
It's almost like a little bit of French farce as like the various doubles are moving through reception at the Space Center.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You could play it for sort of dramatic impact or laughs. Yeah. And it basically does neither.
No.
So the conclusion is just flick a switch basically, which does feel a bit unearned.
I mean, that's the thing. I don't want to say like. I mean, I obviously I've just been incredibly critical of this, and I don't think I like this as much as you did. I can sort of see why I'm not agog that you sort of probably found this a fairly easy watch. I think partly because it's an era where like Doctor Who is being exceptionally well made.
Yeah,
it's like nothing's being taken for granted. it's being well invested. It's like everyone's sort of at the peak of their powers. So it goes down easy.
There's a floor beneath which it doesn't really go. Right?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. But it's like if it's this era running on fumes, the fumes are a little more intoxicating than those of another era, shall we say?
Yeah.
Can we talk about Tom Baker? Because it feels like a while. Well, I suppose. I mean, last year we talked about Genesis the Daleks, but it certainly feels. I mean, in actual time, it's been a while since we've sat here and talked about Tom Baker. I mean, he's bloody good in this. The thing that really strikes me.
Let's try the pub.
Yeah.
I mean, Tom Baker's face lights up given that line 100%. In episode 1.
Yeah. And I also love the way they keep going like, what are you having, sir? And so, I'll have a pint of ginger pop.
Yes.
And he keeps demanding pints, but then throwing. And like the scenes where he's in the pub are really, really good because you sort of realise, and I think it's not, obviously everyone talks about what a commanding presence Tom Baker is. He plays it with real menace here. Like if he knows that someone is keeping something from him, and he obviously knows that there's something dodgy about this landlord, but he's not kind of figured out what the deal is yet. He plays it with such an air of menace. It's real kind of like cat and mouse.
Yeah.
And you can see just through like...
Thanks for the hospitality.
Brute force. Yeah.
It's really,
But all of that... stuff, sort of just idly sort of flicking through the calendar and making sure that the guy knows that he spotted the calendar. It's just all of these tells that he's able to put.
Because the calendar, of course, has the same day.
Yes.
All the time.
And to be fair, that's a lovely line where he goes, village without a future,
Yeah.
It's actually pretty good.
I mean, I did quite like again, it's a vignette rather than a kind of theme or something you can hang your hat on to have a weighty discussion about. But I quite liked that sort of window into a particularly unkind aspect of the English experience.
Yeah.
Right? Like just the idea that you would go into a village pub.
We've been into pubs like that are not staffed by androids.
Right, exactly. I mean,
totally.
The whole like American Werewolf in London, what's that? The Cloven Hoof.
Yeah.
Is it? No, the Cloven Hoof's the pub in the Damons, isn't it?
Yes.
I can't remember the name.
Slaughtered Lamb.
That's it. So, but that thing of walking in and either there's the big hush because you've kind of disturbed their space, or just being ignored really and sort of considered part of the problem, and that's very much something that does exist. And they do say like we don't usually get outsiders or that sort of thing.
It's an interesting point that like. Basically, at some point, I don't know, like at what point did like the unfriendly British pub become such a trope? Because obviously it's a really familiar, and I suppose, I mean, I guess it is Welsh, but it's like, they even do it again in 73 Yards, don't they?
Oh, to great effect. Yeah,
to very great effect.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's such a cliche of like, the unfriendly pub where there's all the eyes on the neck when you walk in. It's like, I'd be interested to see where that comes from, other than reality.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of pubs are unfriendly. I mean, this isn't sort of a pub podcast, but it is really striking when you hear sort of landlords and landladies complaining about how difficult the pub trade is at the moment. It's like, well, it would help if a lot of pubs were just a bit nicer. And anyway, but that's an aside. Yeah, I think Tom Baker's amazing here, and the bit where he's tied to the village cross with the bomb about to go off, and he says to whichever Kral it is, I'm gonna stay for a few minutes.
That is good.
It's I thought there was a degree of wit in the writing.
Yeah.
I smiled at a few places. Like you said, there's quite a bit of money on the screen there. Quite a big supporting cast and extras and so on and so forth. I will say,
they've cleared a village. They've got a truck that comes in and out.
But you've got Sergeant Benton.
I was going to come on to this.
You've got Harry.
Yeah.
Obviously, you don't have the Brigadier because I understand that.
You can obviously see they would have done if
Well, Nicholas Courtney wasn't available for whatever reason, and I quite like the even more blah 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 sort of guy that they get in, but they're not brought back for any particular reason. Like, you know, if you bring back much loved characters, you sort of would give them something to do, wouldn't you?
Well, I was thinking about this. I mean, this was so Ian Marter as Harry and John Levine as Benton. This was their last sort of regular. Yeah, I mean, John Levine isn't. Is John Levine in? No, it's Mike Yates is in the Five Doctors, isn't it? So
yes,
this was their last appearance in the series, and apparently they were quite sort of unhappy that basically it's just a sort of it's a petering out, really. And you do see how, and there's this sort of push and pull with how different eras of Doctor Who kind of reset themselves. Obviously, Tom Baker's first story, Robot, is a unit story, clearly like from the Pertwee team. So Philip Hinchcliffe only takes over from the Ark in Space. So the last Barry Letts story is the first Tom Baker story. And that's a unit runaround, I think, clearly designed to reassure the audience, like the new guy's the same as the old guy.
Yeah.
And then obviously you get like, units back at the end of the season for Terror of the Zygons. Oh no, sorry, that's the beginning of this season.
Right.
But they're sort of, they're sort of units kind of like drifting into the background for something that was like, part of the core format, in the a couple of years earlier. And it does seem, because obviously now it would be like, oh my God, these guys are back. Whereas here it's more just like they're sort of drifting around in the background, and it's like, it's sort of not how you would, not how you do it now, I think.
No, but it's
a bit unsatisfying.
It is, and I think unsatisfying is exactly the word, and of a piece with the not quite landing doubles aspect, where you could have done something more interesting with that. Notwithstanding the kind of technical limitations of being able to have two people on the same screen, but it wasn't handled particularly deftly. I come back to the production values though, because I loved the design of the androids, where the reveal when the Sarah Jane android falls,
that's great.
The face falls off. It's brilliantly cut,
and that is
the design is great.
Rightly fated as one of the sort of great Doctor Who cliffhangers, because the way she sort of just slumps over to the side and the face falls off. I mean, it's perfectly. I don't know how many takes it would have taken to get that sequencing to work as perfectly it does.
But also it needs to be cut just so.
Absolutely, yeah.
But also just the design of that.
Yeah, the sort of sort of stuff
that.
going on inside. Yeah.
And also the when Sarah Jane electrocutes the unit guard double, and like there are like chest explosions through his uniform and stuff like that. It's just, there's a level of attention to detail on how this is going to look on the screen that is very clearly loving, and a lot of effort has gone into it. And for me, I suspect that papered over a few of the, papered over the chasms in the lack of particular thematic meat, or the inconsistencies and incoherence of the plot, the lack of a convincing villain, the stupidity of Milton John's character. The list is almost endless, and yet it seems to sort of, the adventure of it sort of carried some momentum for me.
But this is the great challenge of Doctor Who, isn't it? Is getting all the pieces to fire at once. I mean, there are certain areas, we've talked about a couple of times recently in the last few weeks about the Jodie Whittaker era, where it's basically, the actual execution of it, pretty top notch, I think, but like all resting on, terrible scripts.
Yeah.
And there are other eras like, the McCoy era, which I think I'm probably slightly more sort of sympathetic to than you are, but certainly where I think we'd agree there are a lot of interesting sort of potentially productive ideas that get squashed in the execution, basically.
Yes.
And you do realise that, that is the fundamental challenge of Doctor Who, and, to get it to deliver on both fronts. And I think maybe, just my criticism of it is just, compared to...
I mean, Tom Baker, when he bursts through that window... You know, when he jumps through the window, hands first, head first, and then runs on the top of the building. By the way, these androids, I mean, they're a poor shot, is all I'll say.
They are a poor shot, and I think it's sort of. I mean, that's it. The other, I mean, it doesn't really relate to anything else that we're saying, but I just want to. I noted it that it's like quite a lot of this does very obviously lift from Spearhead from space as well. A few years earlier, the fact, I mean, literally the TARDIS materializing in the woods at the beginning, the sort of people shooting through their fingers, the sort of android walk kind of bursting through the woods and stuff. But also then at the end where like you've got military and unit guys tracking meteorites that kind of change trajectory. It's like, wait a minute, the meteorites are slowing down. And I was like, I mean, we have seen exactly this scene a few years earlier. I just want to talk a little bit about Guy Crayford and Milton Johns, because Milton Johns a regular turn in this, like in that he definitely does pop up every couple of years playing. I mean, he's very good at that sort of
everyone's favourite Quisling.
Yeah, exactly. But there was something that I thought. I mean, you're absolutely right that it a lot of this rests on him being fundamentally stupid, which is quite unsatisfying. There's something about
the level of stupidity that you would hope would probably be screened out of a astronaut selection program.
Yeah, but there is something about like, and I was trying to think how many other examples are there. I couldn't immediately recall any, but there must be some of like Stockholm syndrome being something in Doctor Who. Like, it's not just that he, for whatever reason, has decided to ally himself with the Krulls. Like, he genuinely believes. He says, "I owe them everything." You know, he's like, I mean, obviously he's basically just been abducted by them and totally brainwashed. But it's like he really does believe that he owes them everything. And I don't think it's.
I suspect they stuck him on that rocket to get rid of him, the British space program, because he's such an annoying, oily little man. And I suspect they went, you know what, this is a solution here. We'll stick him in the rocket, sod off around Jupiter for a bit. At least we've got a few years without him. At least, you know. I don't think. I mean, I love to see Milton Johns, but the character doesn't make any sense. And any kind of post hoc justification you're trying to do here,
no. I just thought, because I noted the line as it went when he says like, "I owe them everything," but ultimately it's like, particularly when he rips the eye patch off, and just thought he's never taken the eye patch off.
Like I say, he doesn't take a shower.
No, it's grim. Well, you know, it's a different. It was a different time, John.
I suppose he might have.
I mean, can you imagine?
Just not
the set of Doctor Who must have stank of basically fag ash and booze.
Well, next week, of course, we're doing one of the Black White Guardian trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
And
God, those costumes must have absolutely reeked, mustn't they?
So I think, you know, if this were Smell-O-Vision, this wouldn't be anywhere near the top of the most odorous Doctor Who. But,
fair enough.
People can kind of lose themselves a little bit when they come in here. They forget they're in an art gallery, they forget they're in an art installation.
It's a huge space, so it's a little strange to just put one work in this space, but I'm hoping it really helps with the juxtaposition of, you know, you walk in and it feels like a very comfortable bar. I think you really are transported to a different place, but then you walk out and, you know, it's like, oh, yeah, it's just a crate and, you know, that's not real. But I think that's part of it.
So it's one of those weeks where I'm going to reach into the bulging, I'll explain later, sack and pull out some correspondence, because people...
Oh, thank God.
We spend ages at the end of every episode imploring people to get in touch.
And one of them has.
Well, two.
Oh, wow.
So, okay. Two bits of feedback here. So this is good. So we heard, first of all, from Neil Rafferty.
There were three bits of feedback, but the third has gone straight to our lawyers.
They're hosting next week's episode, by the way. Neil Rafferty got in touch, long time listener, who left us a YouTube comment. Thank you very much. If you are enjoying this via YouTube, please do feel free to
read those,
Matt. Comment below. I do. Well, I get I get asked if I want to approve them. So
Oh,
that's,
I see.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Which,
And, yeah.
I mean, basically,
We'd always approve Neil's. Big
I'll-
friend of the show.
I'll approve anything. But Neil got in touch on our Five Doctors episode to say, I was afraid this one was where we'd fall out, as I adore this daft old love letter to this daft old show to an extent that means I'm likely to invite to step outside anyone who wallows with too much relish in its many and very obvious flaws.
Okay.
Happy
I feel
to
like I'm being.
happy to say that you managed to stay on the right side of the line, and that your solicitors will therefore not be hearing from my mother after all. I mean, how far would we have had to go? I mean, we absolutely, you absolutely slammed the Five Doctors.
Yeah, it was funny actually because when I was listening back to that episode when it
you
came
went
out,
hard on the Five Doctors.
Yeah, and I think I didn't perhaps get across. I mean, I did say this. I do have affection for it,
Yeah.
but I think the scales have just fallen from my eyes at this point. Like
I've seen it enough.
I've seen it too many times to not then notice it as the piece of telly that it is, rather than as a symbol of something.
I think that's also something, and Elizabeth Sandifer talked about this in her review of The Power of the Doctor. And obviously, she's been right, well, like us. I mean, more so than us, actually.
Can you remind me which one The Power of the Doctor is?
Final Jodie Whittaker story
Right.
that contains.
Because there's so many bloody of the Doctors.
Yes,
that, you know.
So many. It's got loads of the earlier Doctors in it.
Yes.
And she sort of made the point. I'm paraphrasing wildly here, that it's like there is something about like us Doctor Who fans were quite easy to play with the nostalgia buttons, and I think even in something that is like absolute dreck, like our brains are so conditioned to go like, oh my God, it's Sylvester McCoy or something, even just momentarily before you go, oh no, wait a minute, this is absolute dog shit.
Yeah.
And the Five Doctors, actually, like as we said, Pertwee and Troughton are really good in it, and kind of like played very well by Terrance Dicks. But yeah, it's like it was interesting that like those old tunes. We're here for nostalgia as much as anyone, but those old tunes weren't working for you. But anyway, look,
nostalgia ain't what it used to be.
Very good. But yeah, well, I'm glad that we didn't go too far for you, Neil. He also said Matt's description of quote it went out as part of the Children in Need celebrations conjured a rather different tone to those evenings and broadcasts I remembered. Fair enough. Which is like, yeah, maybe that wasn't the best choice of words. But,
No.
He also said, PPS, you also didn't mention Davison's abject failure at the very end, not only to hold for all of 3 seconds a nostalgic grin, but to prevent it from lapsing into I really must get out of this fucking show frown.
Yeah, I think that's spot on observation from Neil, to be honest.
It does, like, it's all of seconds that he can maintain that. Why not? After all, that's how it all started.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's such a weird delivery of the line as well. He clearly only gave them one take, I think.
Yeah. I love the idea that Davison's like, you're only getting one.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks, Neil. Thanks for watching, and no, we appreciate it. I mean, I'd like to hear a spirited defense of the Five Doctors. I'm there for it, but it's like I'm just not sure what it would be. But anyway, we also heard from a friend of the show, James Kettle, who wrote to us to talk about our Lodger episode from a few weeks ago. And he said, another great episode. I do think, though, that there is an unexplored disjoint between your political diagnosis of Terrance Dicks and your analysis of what he was responsible for in the Pertwee era. I think he's much more soft-centrist, albeit within the context of what that is for someone raised during World War II. So basically, this is we regularly bring out. We bring out Terrance Dicks as an example of diversity in the classic series, which is probably not true, but it's sort of in terms of the sort of breadth of thought during the Pertwee era.
Yeah,
and we've pinned him very much into a sort of conservative. We've said he's a conservative. He's a right winger, acting as a sort of counterweight to all of the other creatives during that era. And I think James is probably right that it's like my main evidence for this is largely comments on DVD extras, where he has a sort of, let's say, sort of rosy-hued view of empire.
Yeah.
But he said, James goes on to say that I think the colony's position would be reasonably centrist for those of his age. He did still write the last draft of The Mutants, so he can't have been all that dogmatic about it. And then he wants to say, I think Dicks was probably more Thorpe than Heath. That's why the miners aren't the bad guys in Monster of Paladin. Yeah, I mean, it's mainly me that's sort of driven this idea of Dicks as the right winger. Have I been unfair?
I think it's probably a fair cop. But I think it's... So I did a bit of digging on this, and it turned out that Terrance Dicks had written a book about politics in the 90s.
Really?
Yeah, sort of history of parliamentary politics in the UK, which I was completely unaware of.
Was it 144 pages?
It was,
and have a chapter called Escape to Danger.
Something of a Reader's Digest. But in that, and there's a blog post about trying to divine his politics through the prism of that book.
Right.
Which we'll link to in the show notes.
Yeah.
And I think
that's probably a more substantial text to work off than me trying to divine his politics through a DVD extra.
And through that, the author of the blog post, and obviously I haven't read the book, but sort of divines him as a sort of, basically a kind of Buttskalite middle sort of post-war consensus character, not partisan, not particularly enamored of Thatcherism, not also very dubious about nationalisation and the far left.
And you certainly see in a lot of stuff where he's talking about the era and talking about the people he worked with, he's sort of affectionately amused by the sort of slightly more pinko tendencies of kind of everyone around him.
Yeah, like the Bristol boys, what they
Bob Baker and Dave Martin.
So I think James Kettle is probably right. I think he, in a way, he is a voice of conservatism with a lowercase c.
Yeah.
Versus the more radical people who were perhaps around him. Whether that was a kind of hippie-ish radicalism or a socialist radicalism, but there was radicalism around him, and he was probably the more conservative voice in it. But I think it comes back to what we also said when we last discussed this topic, which is the nature of conservatism itself has changed so much.
Yeah.
So what did it mean to be a lowercase c conservative in those days? It would be not necessarily if it moves, privatize it.
Yeah.
Or let's other this group of people and make sure that they can't participate in the full aspect of society, but to be cautious about radical change, to value institutions, to want to embed change rather than necessarily drive it. And that is something that would have characterized someone on the centre right until quite recently, and yet the right seems to be more and more focused on a sort of tear it up view of the world.
Yeah.
So I think James is right. Like I think we probably have erred if we've left people with the impression that he's sort of tucked himself up in bed at night and read Mein Kampf to get off to sleep, sort of. So if we have left anyone with that impression, we apologise. It seems... Terrance Dicks, of course, also wrote a series of children's books about a teddy bear.
T.R. Bear.
Yeah, based on like Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt is an interesting character, obviously quite a belligerent and militaristic kind of figure, but also... trust busting and sort of in terms of sort of competitive against sort of the build up of monopolies and that sort of thing. So it's not like he is a sort of Republican or was a Republican president in the way that perhaps we would think of them these days. So he's probably quite politically more interesting than we have said.
Well, I know what book I'm getting you for the next Christmas special as well. Good stuff. Well, James, Neil, thanks so much for getting in touch. You know where to find us, but I'm going to tell you again. You can drop us an email to hello@I'llExplainLater.com.
I'll explain later.
You can find us on Blue Sky. I'll explain later. Do you have to say @I'llExplainLater.busky.social?
I think if you type
just search I'll Explain Later.
if you type "I'll explain later,"
yeah,
one word into Blue Sky. If you're using Blue Sky, you'll find us.
We are also on Instagram, and we still have our X account @ExplainLaterPod. Or if you're watching this on YouTube or listen to this via YouTube podcasts, you can leave us a comment below. Please do.
Like and subscribe.
Tell a friend if you've enjoyed this episode.
Yeah.
But otherwise, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll be back
Next week.
Take care.
Till then.